by the politics of belonging to particular communities and by this notion of a community relations agenda that sometimes challenges individuals to engage differently with their neighbors than political frameworks allow. That is to say, Jews and Muslims interact in America both as individuals, private citizens, and citizens of a larger polity, but also interact together officially through our organizations who are ostensibly working on behalf of our local communities, but in ways that sometimes inhibit what it means to be an individual actor. So we want to try to name some of those challenges on both the personal and institutional level, and try to talk about how do we create cultures of trust, character witnessing, and transparency between our communities. So thanks again to all three of you for being here, and I appreciate the challenge of taking on something with this kind of political edge, which is live and public, and also other people are watching and listening. And that actually goes to the heart of what we're trying to do with this conference here, which is, if we're really going to talk to each other as Jews and Muslims, we have to actually look at some of the infrastructures and structures that get in the way of really talking to each other, even if we ultimately decide that for the purpose of leading our own communities, that prioritizing some of that community relations work is actually still critical. So I want to start with first asking you somewhat personally to talk a little bit, each of you, about which aspects of the community agenda do you feel that it's really critical for individual leaders to toe the line on? What do you think are the critical components of the community relations agenda? I would ask you, Rabia and Debbie, to first talk about the Muslim community relations agenda, and then David to talk about the Jewish community relations agenda. And where do you expect that individual leaders are supposed to toe the line on those issues? And where are the areas, which we'll get to next, in which there should be much more individual autonomy to be able to step out of those frameworks? So Rabia, why don't we start with you?
Right, great, thank you. And once again, good afternoon, everybody. And thanks, Shalom, Hartman, and the Heschel School for hosting this fantastic conference and giving us something really productive and meaningful to do on Martin Luther King Day, which is also very important to me. So I wanted to talk a little bit about, so we'll start to talk about the issues that individuals, oh, I'm sorry, maybe I'm speaking too loud. Individuals as leaders in our communities are expected to toe the line on, and I think by extension, organizations and institutions also are. And I think when it comes to the Muslim community, we're looking at like 3 or 4 really kind of central issues that are almost non-negotiable in a way. After 9/11, certainly the issue of civil rights for American Muslims is something that is front and foremost at the consciousness of both leadership and institutions and organizations. In the aftermath of 9/11, many of the policies around policing, surveillance, and even immigration and other sorts of issues cropped up that put Muslims in a very defensive posture in this country. And our response has been very kind of centered on the civil rights agenda. And of course, in the last year with the presidential election and some of the promises that have been made, things like a Muslim registry, these issues are not going to leave the forefront of our concerns. Now, having said that, I mean, the issue of civil rights is directly tied to another issue. I mean, all these issues are kind of tied, but also contradictory, and that is one of terrorism. So, the expectation on that issue is kind of an external expectation that you are going to condemn terrorism, and we expect that condemnation. We expect active, continuous condemnation of terrorism, which puts Muslim leaders in a bit of a bind, because if you are thinking about civil rights and civil liberties, to then say, well, with every incident, any incident that we condemn terrorism, you are both implying that we have something to do with it, and kind of hurting your own civil rights agenda. But at the same time, if you don't do it, that also creates the problem. So on terrorism, we have to have a certain line and vocality and visual and presence that we're also, but again, contradictory to that is that at the same time, the line that we have to balance on is our response. When I say our, I mean the country's response to terrorism, the war on terror. I mean, this is an issue, and Western military aggression. These are issues that there's a consensus with everybody. There's really very little room for negotiation. There's even very tight space to work on these issues. For example, I work in CVE, which is countering violent extremism. I have in a policy field for a number of years now. There's a lot of pushback even on that. So the response of the Western world to terrorism, the continuous war on terror, that is, as we are condemning terrorism, we are also condemning the response to terrorism. So and there's also very much anti-war stance. But what's interesting is that while there is a general anti-war stance amongst Muslim leadership, which looks mostly like anti-US military aggression, you don't see a lot of commentary and focus on specific conflicts except for one particular conflict, and I'll let you guess what conflict that is. That is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And that's not just limited to American Muslim leaders and institutions. In the last year, I spent much time in Pakistan doing research on what the concerns of university age students are in that region. And one of the questions we posed to them was, what is the biggest challenge facing Muslims globally today? And the overwhelming response, I mean, this is in a country that is constantly attacked by terrorists, that has poverty issues, that has all kinds of developmental issues. They overwhelmingly identified as the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as being the most, of the biggest challenge to. So that conflict is also at the forefront, and there's very, very little room to move, wiggle room on that as a policy issue. Very long answer, I'm sorry.
Thank you.
First of all, assalamu alaikum, peace and greetings, everyone. I'm really delighted to be here and to actually participate in a dialogue on something that's really very close to my heart. I want to start off by saying that this is actually the very first time that I am actually engaging the Jewish establishment, mainstream Jewish establishment, since my founding of the Khalil Gibran International Academy, where it was founded in 2007. And I was aggressively attacked by individuals within the Jewish establishment and organizations that basically stood on the sideline and actually allowed the attacks to take place on me, especially organizations such as the UJA, JCRC, who I work with very closely in New York City. And for organizations, prominent organizations such as those organizations, to simply sit on the sideline and let the course take its way in terms of the way that I was vilified, to the point that I was actually forced out of my position by Mayor Bloomberg, who was in office at that time, was quite devastating. So I will ask for your forgiveness for my actually being very brutally honest with you, because I think it's really, really important for you all to get the opportunity to personally hear from me if we are planning to do anything substantial that will benefit both of our communities. And so I say that, as my brothers and sisters in faith, we are all, children of Abraham. We are all Semites. And so some of the things that I may say during the course of our discussion will be constructive criticism, but I want you to know that it comes from a place of love and a place that I want us to go to the next level if we're going to engage in this kind of dialogue. So Rabia answered the question, extensively, and the only thing that I'll add to it is the aspect of Islamophobia. Islamophobia has impacted the American Muslim community extremely. And it just did not start within the last couple of years or during this presidential race, but it has been systemic. And it actually started back in 2005, leading to actually reaching its climax when I founded the Khalil Gibran International Academy, where you have individuals such as Daniel Pipes and Steve Emerson, Robert Spencer and Pamela Geller, who basically found the opportunity to attack the school and attack me, and were actually sadly legitimized by city government that actually caved and pandered to their propaganda. But we have to go back and look at who these individuals are and how they were able to do what they did. And sadly, they were able to do what they did because they were very financially stable, because they received a great deal of money from foundations and philanthropists that were actually supporting their work. And there have been multiple reports that have been done. So for example, Fear Incorporated, where actually it highlighted some of this that I'm talking about, but also traced the money. And some of this money, sadly, was coming from Jewish foundations and philanthropists. And so we have to ask ourselves, if we really want to do this kind of work, how are we going to do it without undermining and sabotaging the work? We really have to connect in a way that will be open and honest, where there will be no betrayal, and where we will be each other's keepers, protecting one another and being able to stand for one another. So I think, finishing up my response to this answer, I think it's really looking at Islamophobia and the Islamophobia machine, and who the stakeholders are, and how can we as communities actually take a more prominent role to actually working against these voices that are fringe, that don't represent what we all think and what we all feel. And when we are able to address this, I think then we will be able to have an opportunity to do productive work. I also want to, again, emphasize the point that Rabia made about the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. We cannot pretend that does not exist. It exists. But what we need to do is figure out how we as two communities are going to be able to come together when there is a crisis there, that will be a collective response that will not, undermine each other's platform, as well as the platform of the work that we're trying to do. And I'll give you an example of what I mean. So let's say, for example, several years back, this was actually maybe 7-8 years ago, when Yasser Arafat passed away, JCRC put out a scathing statement after his passing away. And members of the Arab and Muslim community who were actually involved with JCRC and other organizations in a Muslim-Jewish dialogue here in New York. When we saw that, as Muslims and as Arabs, we were horrified, not because we had any sympathy or care or, to Yasser Arafat, but the fact is that this man is a human being and he's just passed away. And we can't honor the human beingness of an individual and let that person be put to rest without such horrible things being said was quite sad, and it was quite devastating. And so what it created for our group that came together was this huge rift. And so every time that something happened in the Middle East, we found ourselves back at square one of those rifts. And it's because of the responses that members of the Jewish establishment have chosen to take. Now, how can we respond without undermining the opportunity to actually work together? So I'll stop there.
Great. Thank you, David.
Thank you. So it's an honor to be here. It's an honor to be here with Rabia and Debbie to have this public dialogue. And I really appreciate the opportunity to really go deep here, because it's something that my organization, the Jewish Council for Public Affairs, is going deeper in. And it's really important for us to have this type of setting to help launch such efforts nationwide. I'm going to start with two very quick stories. The first was, can you all hear me? Okay, let me just, is this better?
Yes.
Okay. The first story is in 2005. It's when Pope John Paul II had just passed away, and I was invited, and when I'm working for a different organization, to go on local TV to talk about the Pope's legacy and the legacy of Catholic-Jewish relations. I get to the newsroom, walk into the green room, and there is an official of a Muslim organization that my organization at the time would not work with. And he was there too to join me to talk about the Pope's legacy on Muslim Catholic relations. And we had a nice exchange at that time. And right after we were done, I looked at him and he looked at me, and I said, how about coffee? He said, sure, let's do it. So we went out for coffee and we talked about all kinds of things. And at the very end of that conversation, I called the question. I had heard that your organization opposes terrorism, but do you consider terrorism against Israeli civilians as terrorism? And he paused for a while and he said, no, but I'll explain in another coffee. Second story. 1994, my wife and I, who had just been married, were going to Israel for the first time. And this was in the immediate aftermath of Baruch Goldstein's horrific massacre of 29 Palestinians who were worshiping in a mosque. And it was a very tense moment. My wife had discovered a long-lost friend who lived in a settlement and invited us for dinner. And we drove up there to sit and have a meal. And when we got to talking, the husband of this woman who I'd never met said to me, you know, many of us consider what Baruch Goldstein did a Kiddush Hashem, a sanctifying God. And so at the first moment I had, I turned to my wife and I said, I got to get out of here. And it was not an intellectual response, it was an emotional response. I just couldn't be in this person's presence at the time. Now I think about these two stories, it hit me that if there was any primary boundary for the Jewish community, we might debate on all manner of things regarding Israel, but if there were any primary boundary, I think most people agree that mass murder committed by a Jew or committed by a Muslim is sort of beyond the pale, and anybody who supports it or justifies it is not someone we're going to be in an active dialogue with, want to be in an active dialogue with. The problem is that primary litmus test has given rise to a secondary and sometimes a tertiary litmus test that says, if you've ever stepped foot in the same room as that radical, whether it's a Jew or a Muslim, you are now contaminated and you are now implicated and you now are beyond the pale of dialogue as well. And I think, thankfully, that has begun to erode. And you've written compellingly about this. Yossi Klein-Halevi gave a very important speech at the American Jewish Committee about this. We see the ISNA AJC council now, and I think we see the possibility that some of these litmus tests that we've been applying that have prevented dialogue, that have made it impossible to engage, are now on the decline. And I think that's a good thing. I think now's a moment to re-engage in a very serious way, knowing we still might have some red lines, but also knowing that there are opportunities that we've given ourselves to engage in a serious way.
So I'm going to try to, first of all, thank you to all three of you for putting a lot of really important stuff on the table and for speaking candidly. And if we're going to do this, we might as well be candid. So let me take a chance to ask each one of you a follow-up question, which is, David, you know, when you set up and I'm with you on the litmus test, and I think that even that language of first tier and second tier of litmus test is really valuable. But in a person in your position who represents an umbrella organization for JCRCs, I imagine, especially in a growingly politically polarized climate, is being pushed to take bolder stances than simply that the boundaries of the litmus tests are supporting mass murder. I think we can get behind that. But how do you respond when people push you and say, no, it's not just mass murder, it's also the particular rhetoric during the presidential campaign that was anti-Muslim. And knowing that you have the responsibility of actually holding a broader community than one particular political position, how do you both stretch beyond the limited litmus test of mass murder towards these other degrees of responsibility to other communities while still holding the broad swath of the community you're supposed to represent?
Sure. So going back to the original idea that it's time now to start lowering some of these litmus tests, to make it easier for ourselves to engage. I think traditionally, we've been too quick to condemn everything that we don't like and too slow to engage. We assume that condemnation equals counteraction, that we hear something that is problematic to us, so therefore we've got to condemn it. And we don't give enough credence to the possibility that engaging the other, even the people that have said things that we might find problematic, might actually do more to change their point of view than condemning what they said in public. So I think starting from a place of engagement will help us along the way. The other thing is that we have to give each other cover, political cover, and take chances along the way. So the fact that AJC was willing to engage ISNA in a public dialogue helps the JCPA, and I think the JCRCs now, engage in a serious way with groups that might have been considered beyond the pale just a year ago or 2 years ago. When you write, or Yossi Klein-Halevi writes on this matter, it allows us to speak more publicly. So I'm looking to take risks, but at the same time, sort of be part of a cascade of risk-taking that other leaders also exert, so that we can give each other political cover and change the overall political dynamic.
Okay, so Debbie, your example at the end was particularly evocative around Arafat's death, because I think many in the Jewish community would say, well, that's a moment in which we want to say something very pronounced about Yasser Arafat, and it's not good. And so the question I want to ask is, recognizing that what you've put on the table is actually very big. We're working together with the Jewish community. We want to be with the Jewish community, and we don't want to allow political moments to shatter those relationships. But you also want to work with the Jewish community that speaks honestly and openly about its own political positions. What would you have wanted the Jewish community to have done that in a moment like that, that would both acknowledge, as you said, the humanity, but also allow Jews to speak seriously and with sincerity about why Arafat is such a troubling individual for us?
So let me start by saying that not only does the Jewish community feel that he's a troubling figure, so do a lot of Arabs and a lot of Muslims. What I would have loved to see is just let the dirt on his grave dry a little bit, and then do whatever you want. I mean, we have to honor the humanness of human beings, right? Giving them just that opportunity to be buried and to move forward. And then be able to speak to those issues, you know, in whatever which way that you felt is you know, applicable to your community. So, you know, I brought that issue up because the way that members of my community reacted to it when it happened, and because we were engaged in a dialogue, a Muslim, Arab, Jewish dialogue, where we were getting somewhere. And then something like this happened that basically shattered it for people. And again, there are people who support, you know, Arafat, people who don't support Arafat, but it was just the point of helping members of the Jewish community at that point understand is, can we just let the person be buried and then do whatever you want to do? And so I think that's really critical just to see it. And, you know, other examples of this is, you know, what happened with Keith Ellison. You know, someone who is very prominent, well-known and respected, a figure in the National Democratic, you know, Party, who's seeking this opportunity. And then for the, you know, the ADL president to actually come out publicly and put out that statement, that could have easily been taken care of by a conversation. Pick up the phone, call up Keith, have a conversation with him, better understand it. But we also have to look at how that happened and why that happened. And that happened because Jonathan responded to a report that was actually issued by Steve Emerson. And so we have to look at, like, who are the people that are providing us this information, right? Are they credible, you know, people that we should listen to? And I think so that opportunity to actually have a conversation with Keith might have not had to have that explosion in the media. Another point is also my situation, where I was actually minimized, you know, to a word. The work that I've done as an educator, as a bridge builder, as someone very well known in the city and across the country, to be minimized by, you know, to a word by a tabloid, the New York Post, and members of the Jewish establishment, rather than picking up the phone and calling me and having a conversation with me about this interview, basically decided to move forward and lobby against me, calling the mayor to push me out of my position. And so it's sad and unfortunate that something like that happened. And I want to share with you a really very interesting story. So to 2013, one of the people that was very, very adamant about my opening the school and my leadership was actually Assemblyman Dov Hikind. How many people know Dov? Okay. So he never met me, never had a conversation with me. And then I ran into him at the inauguration of the Brooklyn DA. And I was talking to Jewish leaders from that community. I went over to say hello to them. They're friends and we've worked together in the past, and I wanted to say hello to them. So he comes over to me and he says to me, "Hi, I'm Dov. Do we know each other from somewhere? I feel like I've met you before." I said, hi, Dov, how are you? Where do you think we might have met? He said, well, maybe it was at some kind of Jewish or organizational event. I said, maybe, but let me introduce myself to you. I said, I'm Debbie Almentasser. And he just stood there. I said, and then I finished the sentence. It said, the founding principal of the Khalil Gibran International Academy. Remember that in 2007? And his jaw, I kid you not, dropped. And he just looked at me for a second. He said, I've never met you before. And he felt really uncomfortable at that moment. And I said, well, we've had some interesting history, Dov. What do you think about that? So he, at that point, said something really interesting to me. He said, you know, looking back at what happened to you, I wish I played a different role.
Wow.
Because the way that what ended up happening to you should have not happened. And what I should have done is possibly, I should have called you and not rushed to judgment to think that you were planning to, you know, open a madrasa in New York City. I said, well, it's not too late. You know, you still have the opportunity, you know, to rectify the matter. And he said, well, I don't know how to do it, but here's my cell phone number. If you ever need anything, please don't hesitate to call me. I haven't had a chance yet to call Dov, except to extend my condolences when the little Jewish boy was killed in the Kensington area. But the point of my telling this story is that when we have those personal interactions with individuals and have an opportunity to connect and be able to talk and to see the other person on the other side is actually a human being that mirrors who we are, is something that we really have to think about in the work that we're going to do together.
Okay. Rabia, in your opening comments, you indicated three major arenas: civil rights, terrorism, Islamophobia. And then you alluded to the fact that Israel-Palestine winds up playing this disproportionate role relative to these issues. And obviously the Pakistan analogy is a very powerful one, that that's not just the technical Jewish term, mishigas, but it's actually an international phenomenon to believe that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict obscures all of this. Can you talk a little bit about how I've seen you write publicly increasingly about this. What's the expectation that is there of you with respect to your own community in speaking out about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? And how do you personally, as you've been trying to study this issue yourself, navigate the tensions between what your community expects you to have to say when it comes to these issues and your own wrestling with the conflict?
Well, you know, I mean, I don't want to say expectation, I would say hope for my community, your community, many communities. I mean, I think, look, we're in a time where I feel like we are experiencing an extreme rise of ideological polarization globally. And what we're missing, and even with you know, your question to Debbie about what would you have liked to see, and I thought about myself, what would I have liked to see in a moment like that? And other than respecting, you know, just maybe that small space of time when somebody's being laid to rest, is that we learn to have values-based conversation and consistency. I know that, and the stories that you told in the beginning that's exactly the space I find myself like struggling with my own community, is that we have to show consistency in whatever values we are professing. So whether it is we are against violence, you know, state violence, right? That state violence means that we have to be just as consistent with, you know, engaging with nations like Turkey and others that might be engaged in human rights violations or rights violations, as we are critical of Israel. And we have to be more, you know, consistent on these issues. And I think what I find frustrating both with my community and even when I engage with Jewish communities, and I'm on this new council, the Muslim Jewish American, the advisory council that was established by ISNA and AJC. And again, you know, the backlash to that was immediate when the announcement was made, because again, we are expected to take certain positions. You don't work with certain organizations because we are so hogtied by one international conflict, ongoing situation. So you know, my expectation from the community. And, I have growth to me has been learning to be, what's interesting is in our faith tradition, in the Islamic faith tradition, like moderation is key always, like never take extreme positions. Like we're supposed to be a community of the middle path. And it has taken a lot of time, maybe the last 10, 15 years, for me to realize how we often, extremes are easy, and extremes have become mainstream now. So it's very easy to fall into these buckets, but being nuanced and being moderate and being able to listen to everybody's position and then come to like some kind of, okay, well, at least we can agree on these values. Maybe not interpret facts in the same way. While that's completely reasonable and rational, it's so hard for us to implement on a community and even organizational level. So I do think steps like the engagement with ISNA, and I think ISNA was very brave, and so were the AJC to do that. Mm-hmm. But having said that, I think what happened with Keith Ellison rolled us back a little bit. And my concern there was, and you have, for Muslims who encourage engagement, who can see the value in working with organizations like the ADL. I mean, the ADL does tremendous civil rights work. We need this partnership. We need this cover for each other, civil rights cover and political cover for each other, in which we're working together on these issues that we have the same values on. But there are elements in our community, they say no. In the Muslim community, you shouldn't work with the ADL because of their public positions on Israel. And I have to say that one of my big criticisms of not just the ADL, but I would say American Muslim organizations too, who have very clearly domestic agendas. Their whole purpose of existence is like in domestic policy and working to protect either American Muslims or American Jews and our interests, is that I feel like we really undermine our own work and our own position by taking public foreign policy positions. And then the litmus test kicks in and nobody will work with each other because of this one issue. And we are hurting each other's communities, on top of which we're contributing to this, the cycle of identity politics and polarization. And somebody like Keith Ellison, who I have tremendous respect for, and who is, by the way, right, he is on the right of the Israeli-Palestinian issue to most American Muslims, could have been a very valuable inroad to our community, and would have opened doors to many of us to encourage more engagement with the ADL and other organizations, and just to be in the same spaces so we can get to understand one another better. And so I think that was a lost opportunity, but I hope it's not forever lost. I hope it can still be repaired.
So I'm glad you both raised Keith Ellison, because I want to talk about it a little bit here, and I want to try to do so depersonalized from Jonathan Greenblatt and even a little bit depersonalized from the ADL, both in acknowledgement of Jonathan's courageous leadership in general and in being at this conference, and also because it's more interesting for us to think about the larger issues than it, and the ways that they're surfaced than it is the particular mechanics of a political issue. The area I want to push on is, I get, even in the story that you tell, that somebody who you encounter who is a political opponent would realize that they're treating you as a total stranger and attacking you publicly is not how you act. I got that. Mm-hmm. However, it does seem legitimate and possible that somebody in the Jewish community would say, we are politically and even philosophically opposed to Keith Ellison being the head of the DNC. And how do we get to both, which is the licensing of the ability to be public political opponents between Jewish communities and Muslim leaders and vice versa, but doing it in some way that doesn't get at what you're acknowledging is there was something very wrong about the way that was transacted. David, do you want to jump in? Yeah.
So I would first start where Debbie left off, which is, I think, one of the great purposes of Muslim-Jewish engagement, beyond the potential of coalitions around issues that we share, is getting to know each other, understanding each other's sensitivities and red lines, and being able to call each other when there's an issue like that emerges, so you don't first read about it in the newspaper or see it on television. So I think that's a very powerful purpose. I also think we should recognize that there are times when we're going to disagree. And, I can my organization, I should say, did not take a public stance on Keith Ellison and DNC. But I will say that even if one dismisses some of the arguments that were made against Ellison as being beyond the pale or unfair, that we could, an organization like ours could still say, we disagree with his policy on the Middle East. And we don't want him to be appointed to a public position that will enhance that power. And I would hope that there's still space left over from that, that's not see it just as an act of disenfranchisement, but as an act of a community that's doing what it thinks is its own best interest. Even in the Jewish community, obviously, there are people who disagree with that and think that Keith Ellison would be a fine representative of the DNC. But there are others who don't, and they're not only acting out of a sense of, most are not acting, I would say, out of a sense of animus, but out of a sense of communal interest. And those community interests may collide. And we're, I understand it would be great if not all of us were animated by foreign policy and the foreign policy issues didn't get in the way of a harmonious relationship. But I think we all understand that that's not going to be the case, that organizations like ours do believe that we have an important role to play on some of these foreign policy issues, and we're going to continue to do that. And so I hope that as part of this dialogue, that we can come to a place where we say, we disagreed with you on that, but we understand it didn't come from a place of animus, and we're going to continue this discussion anyway.
Can I just,
Yeah.
Okay, so just two comments. I think, on the Keith Ellison issue, which, Debbie pointed out, it wasn't so much taking a position that is, we don't agree philosophically with this person. It was the sourcing of, like, the reason behind the statement, right? The reason behind the opposition, the sourcing by, of this old video of Steve Emerson. And I feel like, having done due diligence, having really had the conversation with him, having weighed the cost benefits of making such a public statement, that might have tempered what happened, and then also the fallout in the Muslim American community. That, look, it wasn't that they just relied on an old video that was dubbed up by somebody we consider to be a committed anti-Muslim activist. But there's other reasons. There's other evidence that, maybe he's not qualified for this position or right for this position. And I understand, and many of us do understand, that a community has to operate in self-interest. And if I was Jewish American, if I was Israeli, I would also oppose that. But I think the way it unfolded was really what was problematic, and who was relied on for that. Because to be honest, there's almost no American Muslim prominent public figure who has not been attacked by the same group of people, which delegitimizes all of us. And as we have a new administration coming up, that they're actually drawing on some of these names and some of these people to be advising them, it puts all of us at risk in a way that it really almost like, there could be an impending witch hunt, to be honest. And it's going to be for all kinds of prominent American Muslims, including people who've worked at the White House, including people who, like me, who have, worked with Shalom Hartman. I mean, it could be a very broad net, and that's what's kind of scary. The second thing I would say is this, and this is not, this could come across a little harsh, but my concern with not just the focus of Jewish American groups with Israel, but also American Muslim groups with Palestine, and how it overshadows many things, is that we have to recognize, and this was said in an earlier panel on Israel-Palestine, that I feel like, first of all, it's not reciprocated. I can almost guarantee that Jews and Muslims around the world are not as concerned about American Muslims and Jews, okay, as we are about them. Our investment, our emotional investment, our politicization of it, our utilizing it as tools against weapons against one another, it's not done really in the same way. They don't have the same kinds of concerns about it. And I'm not saying that they should or shouldn't, and I'm not saying that we shouldn't because of that. But I'm saying that it means our priority, securing the future of American and Muslim Jews, especially in the current political climate, just keeps getting pushed down because of that issue. And I do understand that, people should show some leadership in the community on, but again, I believe it should be value-based. So if you have a religious leader in the Muslim community or in the Jewish community saying that, Palestinian lives, civilians should not be hurt, well, also, you should also be just as consistent the Israelis, civilians should not be hurt. And that's what we lack. And so, because if you go to that extent, then you've broken the litmus test and your own constituency turns against you. So it's almost, I feel more comfortable when my American Muslim organizations do not court foreign governments and don't prop up their agendas and platforms. I mean, that for my own community, I'm more comfortable with that.
Debbie, you want to weigh in?
Yeah, I also just wanted to point out that we also have to recognize that there is a huge imbalance in influence and in power. And so when we look at, the whole situation of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, and we look at the dynamics within the United States between the two communities, the way that it plays out continually undermines any effort to actually come together. And I'll give another example of when this was actually the case. And there was actually an opportunity to address it in a much more cohesive way that you could actually bring all people, together. And that was actually the Gaza situation with the children on the beach. And so what some of the mainstream Jewish establishment decided to do was actually hold press conferences with elected officials that were actually coined as Stand with Israel. And so you have the Palestinian, Arab, Muslim communities, it's Ramadan, and elected officials are going out there who are their, elected officials and standing for, Israel. And so what was the issue with all of these communities was, well, let's look at who was impacted by these attacks. Let's look at the number of civilians that have been, killed. We've just seen children on a beach killed. And so for many people, this was really something that was very detrimental emotionally, especially in Ramadan, where it's a time to find opportunity for prayer and reconciliation. And so people were very, very disturbed by it. And so some of these elected officials were then asking to go and give their greetings. And quite frankly, the Muslim community said, after we saw you standing for Israel and not standing for peace and reconciliation, we don't know if we want to engage you. And so the point that I made earlier about what could have been the ideal way to respond to that situation is if the Muslim and Jewish community, the establishments came together and said, let's call for peace and reconciliation. Let's recognize, as Rabia was saying, let's recognize the suffering on both sides, but also acknowledge that there is tremendous suffering on the Palestinian, side. And so when we are able to actually connect in that way and acknowledge that, I think that will help us be able to do work. And I would have loved to see, an opportunity for Muslim and Jewish leaders to come out and say, we want peace and reconciliation versus, a one-sided response of stand for Israel. And so I think this is really something that if we're going to be working together and we're going to, look for opportunities to really benefit our existence in the United States, we have to look at ways that we can respond to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict in a way that is amenable to both communities.
I think in some ways I'm going to take some questions from the audience, but in some ways that's the challenge of this panel in particular and this day in general, which is that the nature of the community relations agenda as it exists from both of our communities is a certain type of a privileging of a simple articulation of the values and commitments of particular communities. And that's what is necessitated often by a press release or the speed of a response. I think what you're pushing us towards, and all of you are pushing us towards, is how do you do the work of the simple telegraphing of what a community stands for, while at the same time managing that these simple articulations reflect complex realities, and that simple articulations mask complex interpersonal relationships that have to be sustained under the surface. Let me take a few questions from the audience. I'll take a few and then ask our panels to respond. Yes, can you stand up? There's a mic coming your way.
Thank you. The day after, or the night following the elections, someone wise stood up at Bnei Yeshurun and spoke about three models of engagement. One model is, are you with us or are you against us? The other model spoke about, do you meet certain criteria to be with us? And the third model spoke about, do you show up? And it sounds from your perspectives is that in times of crisis, everyone defaults either to, are you with us or are you against us? And at best, do you meet certain criteria? And the question is, what can both communities do to remain in the space of showing up is as important, if not the most important criteria?
Thank you.
Do we want to answer them?
I'm going to take
Okay.
two or three and then
Okay.
answer. Yes, go ahead. Yes.
Robin, first of all, I'm a huge fan of Undisclosed.
Oh, thank you.
But I think it also,
We hear you though.
okay. I think it also illustrates that the difference between undisclosed and serial is one of intellectual engagement, and in many ways it dives deeper. And my question is we seem to be living in an increasingly anti-intellectual world where I'm just trying to figure out how we get from here and having a dialogue where people are listening, at least listening, and then bringing it out to an anti-intellectual world where I feel like that's really where it needs even more engagement. We're talking about establishments. Fact is, most establishments don't represent most people. So I was curious on your thoughts on how you bring dialogue such as this into a broader anti-intellectual society.
Great. And I'll take one more down here.
Letty Cotton Pogrebin, and the question is to the two Jews on the panel, Yehuda and David. What do you recommend we do internally to actualize our values to the point where when, for example, I'm going to give you three, something happens within our community that should be called out, and because of the kind of third rail of Israel-Palestine as an issue, nothing is done, or the worst possible things are done. Example one, when Rabbi Kleinbaum of the Gay and Lesbian Synagogue a couple of years ago after the Gaza War named among the victims that she named from the pulpit on Yom Kippur the names of the children who died in Gaza. Huge money was taken out of her synagogue for doing that. What should we have done? The second thing, something happened to me 2 days ago. I had been about to sign a contract to give a talk at a federation, and I was blackballed on the grounds that I belong to a radical organization. What radical organization? Shalom, Americans for Peace Now. Blackballed by not a New York federation, but a federation elsewhere. And at B'nai Jeshurun, famously, our rabbis were hounded when they reacted to a UN event. What should the rest of the community be doing, and why are we so prone to silence when obviously we've come here, we represent a lot of organizations, we have the capacity to make noise, make trouble? Why have we become so passive and so cowed? And since it's going to get worse and it is going to be a witch hunt, why aren't we organizing right now to push back?
So three terrific questions. What does showing up look like? That doesn't get into the black and white. What does intellectual engagement look like in an anti-intellectual environment? I don't know what makes you think that the environment we're in is anti-intellectual. And how do we actually actualize our values, to Letty's question? And I think this is true in the Jewish community, but I'm sure it's also true in the Muslim community as well.
I was thinking, you got that too?
Who wants to go first? Yes.
I'm going to pick up on one thing that Debbie said for 1 second, and that is about, you made a statement about imbalance of power between the communities. I just wanted to point out that in the context of America, I'm sure we appear to be very influential. By that, I mean the Jewish establishment. Many Jews, in a different context, the larger global context, feel actually very vulnerable. When you look at the UN votes and so forth, we sometimes see our activism in the United States as a way of sort of counterbalancing what's happening on a global scale. So while we might look strong, we feel very weak at times. So what does it mean to show up? I think what showing up means showing up. In other words, even given all of these sins that we've committed and that maybe you've committed as well, that we still show up anyway, that we come to conferences like this, that we go when we're invited, that we take risks to actually be there, even when we know we're going to face some internal strife in our own community. So on this issue of internal strife within our own community, which actually plays, of course, into our engagement with Muslims. Look, there's no question that the Jewish community has to go through change, if for no other reason that we're alienating large swaths of young Jews in this current discussion. So one thing that I've tried to advise is
The young Jews clapping.
right.
Sorry, we left you
Right.
out.
One thing I've tried to advise is that some of the establishment figures that make these types of discussions most difficult be in dialogue with their own kids and grandkids. Let them hear it, not from me, but from their own kids and grandkids. I have a great story. There's a very prominent Jewish philanthropist who was hostile to some of these groups that you're talking about. And he talked about a visit that he made to his own campus, his alma mater, in which he met with some Jewish students at the Hillel, and he came away saying, I've actually contributed to the situation that we're in now. He learned from that encounter, and I think we have to create many, many more of those encounters in order to have the kind of culture change that we're after. On the question of intellectual engagement, if there's anything that we can do in this environment to make for room for a better America, I think it's to engage at high-level intellectual issues. To me, the counterbalance to this atmosphere, the counterpoint to this atmosphere, is not necessarily to do what those on the extremes are doing, but rather to be a source of information, of truth, and of consistency and of intellectual rigor when we encounter each other. So I would say that that's a great standard for how we might engage each other and a great counterpoint to what we're seeing in American society today.
Go ahead.
I would say that my response to all three of the questions is kind of similar, in that it's like you have to model the behavior yourself, whether it is valuing intellectual conversation and deep dives, and thank you, by the way, for listening undisclosed, whether it is countering these types of backlashes. I mean, I feel the pain of the lady. I very recently had an award rescinded from a very large Muslim organization, umbrella organization in Chicago, when they announced they would be honoring me this year. Because of community pressure, it was rescinded in a very public way because I'm a fellow with Shalom Hartman, and I went through a program with them. But on this issue, and showing up really has to be, again, modeled. Even when we had backlash from Shalom Hartman or MJAC or all of these other kinds of engagements, that a few of us are saying, you know what, for better or worse, we believe that there's a lot of value here, there's meaning here, we want to have conversations with people we haven't spoken to before. We tend to get a lot of support behind the scenes. We'll have a lot of people, a lot of religious leaders and community leaders who privately will contact us, but will not publicly support us. And so we need the courage of those people to do so. And Yehuda has shown tremendous leadership. He in his Facebook posts, whether they're about cooking or anything else. And it wasn't until we really developed relationships with people at Shalom Hartman and in the communities that they reach, that we were able to see the kinds of information that they are looking at and the narratives that they are looking at, and they were able to see us. And I remember one time you said that we're in each other's heads now. So when I write something that's pertinent to the Muslim community, maybe it's relevant also to the Jewish community and vice versa, and I'll share that. I'll say, look, we do have shared values. You cannot say because this is an organization that we're just going to boycott, that you have to look at the human beings who make up this organization. And we need more people like Yehuda. We need more people who have the courage to say, you know what, that we cannot remain forever like in our corners, and basically just model the behavior.
Debbie?
Yeah. Thank you, Rabia. And I just want to start off by saying that responding to your question about showing up, What we need to do is create the environment to be able to show up, right? There needs to be a sense of safety and trust, and an opportunity to be able to really hear one another and put ourselves in the shoes of the other. So I think when we get to that point and we can actually develop that kind of environment for people, people will be able to come together and do it. In addition to that, when there are situations that exist on the public front, we need to be able to get ourselves to the point that we stand up for one another, right? So in my case, back in 2007, I would still be in my position had members of the Jewish community who knew me very well stood up for me and basically said, we're not taking this, we don't believe in this, this is ridiculous, we know her record, and we stand by her, right? That could have happened. And I think when we start to be able to do that for one another, we will be able to work collectively and to actually do a whole lot more productive work together. Now, I know the statement that I'm about to say right now may sound very, Pollyanna, but it would behoove our communities, both the Muslim and Jewish community, if we did not eventually say to one another that we need collectively to work on the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. We can move mountains if we just believe in each other and believe in our intentions and what we want to see. At the end of the day, all we both communities want to see is peace and security for both communities. If we're able to bring the establishments in the Muslim and Jewish community together to work on that and to influence the UN, to influence the US government, all the brokers that are out there who can possibly bring peace to that part of the world, our issues will no longer exist.
So I'll just say as a last comment, in moments like this is something that Ariella Dubler said to us when we brought her the idea of doing this conference here at the Heschel School. She said, in moments like this, politically sensitive moments, there's an impulse to activism and there's also an impulse towards building community. And she's channeling in that comment the rabbinic texts that struggle with the fact that you have this biblical phrase that talks about loving both peace and truth. And they ask, how can you actually hold peace and truth at the same time when peace is about relinquishing some of our truth and truth is about being right? And that is where holiness is found, is at the ability to inhabit both of those spaces. So I want to just, part of me says in response to your question, Letty, there's a whole bunch of things that have to happen on the progressive side of the Jewish community to create greater strength, that you can't just be disinvited without consequences. But the larger takeaway is also that we have to do a lot of the work that I think our panelists exhibited today and that we're trying to do at this conference more broadly, which is to create large-scale communities of the rational and the reasonable, to believe that actually the rational and the reasonable are and always will outnumber the extreme voices that are going to suppress what's possible in those places, to create context for deeply holy and public disagreement, and to model that type of disagreement as the vision for what we actually want for our communities. Thank you to all three of you.
Thank you. Thank you.